Yes, it's time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast foreign editor, Christopher Dickey. How are you, sir?
Very happy to be here.
Glad you could join us. Glad to see you as well. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, columnist for the Sunday Telegraph. Nice to see you. Anne Penkett, writer and author, novelist at times.
Yes, indeed.
What's your next book called?
My next one is called The Marsh. It's a crime novel. You'll be the first to hear when it's published, François.
All right, a crime novel. We'll be waiting for that. We love visitors, and we have one. France 24 Jerusalem correspondent Iris Makler is with us. Nice to see you.
Very nice to be in this studio.
The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24Debate, the hashtag World This Week. It's Friday. The leader of the Labour Party describes it as a tragedy beyond a tragedy, with 7 days to go before Britain decides whether to stay or leave in the European Union. 41-year-old Member of Parliament Jo Cox stabbed and shot to death outside the local library where she held regular meetings with her West Yorkshire constituency. A 52-year-old local man with a history of mental illness and alleged far-right sympathies is in custody. The West Yorkshire police saying the attack was believed to have been a targeted one, and they are investigating whether or not there is that link with the far right. As for the Prime Minister, his message was one of inclusiveness.
Most important of all, we should value and see as precious the democracy that we have on these islands, where 65 million of us live together and work together and get on together. And it's all underpinned by tolerance. So where we see hatred, where we find division, where we see intolerance, we must drive it out of our politics and out of our public life and out of our communities.
It's an attack on democracy, what happened yesterday. It's the well of hatred that killed her. She leaves behind a husband who made a truly wonderful statement yesterday, a statement saying that in her memory we would try to conquer hatred with love and with respect.
And Elisabeth Moutet, the well of hatred killed Jo Cox?
To some extent, yes. It's absolutely terrifying, because you know how the situation evolves slowly and you don't see it changing, and suddenly it's born to you incredibly violently that the country that you knew, that you partly grew up in my case, has changed out of recognition. This is not the country described by George Orwell in The Lion and the Unicorn, of maiden aunts biking to Evensong and green grass and red pillar boxes. And it's all of this which held Britain together, was intangible, which George Orwell felt necessary to write about in 1940. We now have the feeling that we're living in 1938. We have political murders in different countries and different continents. We've got the vocabulary of hatred. We've got the dialect of hatred.
And why is that?
I think because politics have been confused with not something that we have in common, but something that divides us. And we see this in America. We see this in France. We see this, of course, we've seen this in the Middle East for many years, but we've got in our minds the kind of sudden wasteland that we did not expect before. I'm very shocked by this.
And this, of course, in stark contrast to the message of the first-term MP in her maiden speech before Parliament last year, when she spoke of her West Yorkshire roots proudly.
Batley in Spain is a gathering of typically independent, no-nonsense, proud Yorkshire towns and villages. Our communities have been deeply enhanced by immigration, be it Irish Catholics across the constituency or Muslims from Indian Gujarat or Pakistan, principally from Kashmir. And whilst we celebrate our diversity, the thing that surprises me time and time again as I travel around the constituency is that we are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us.
Anne Penkett.
That may have been true. It's clearly no longer true. I mean, in the British context, what has happened is the Brexit debate. And it was actually only a couple of days ago that I've been following this really closely and go back to London a lot. I do not recognise my own country, as Anne-Elisabeth said. The poison which has been on both sides of this campaign has been really shocking. I've been berated all day on social media because I just happened to observe this, and to say that something like this was going to happen. The mudslinging that's been going on, not just from the UKIP, from the openly racist Nigel Farage, but also Cameron has been telling lies. All the sides have been at fault in this.
And Penkett, I'm sorry to ask this, but are we reading too much into it? Even though they are looking into extreme right, the extreme right, there's always been, there was Oswald Mosley. There's always been a small fringe of far right people in Britain, and there's always been mudslinging and a few pies told on the campaign trail.
A fringe, of course, yes. But now it's very interesting actually to see socially what's happening at home now, because I think there is a sense that the working class, a lot of the traditional Labour Party voters, feel disenfranchised, and they are speaking out because they've been on the receiving end of immigration, and immigration has hijacked the referendum debate, actually. And it can be justified because, that they're last on the housing lists. There's been a downward pressure on jobs. They can't get their kids into school. But on the other hand, the 800,000 Poles who are now in the UK, they're working. They're paying their taxes. So it's completely dishonest to blame any of this on the EU. And the fault is actually British government policies by the Cameron government, and before that by the Labour government.
Christopher Dickey.
Well, I think we talk about Britain, we talk about the United States, we can talk about France for that matter, about all this anger. And the anger is almost always with people who are in the kinds of that level of class that you're talking about. And it all comes down to, emotionally, it comes down to the idea that this isn't your country anymore, that the country you grew up in, the lion and the unicorn, all that's disappearing. And people blame that on immigration. They've seen it happening gradually, and now they see this tide of immigrants coming across the Mediterranean, coming into Greece. And even though that hasn't had much of an effect on Great Britain, that's been used as an emotional tool by UKIP to basically inspire all kinds of racist attitudes and racist fears and xenophobic fears. There is a fascinating analogy that's just come up today. The UKIP launched a new campaign called Breaking Point. It shows these Middle Eastern immigrants coming in a curve across the land. Some people dug up a Nazi propaganda film.
We can call up, in fact, that poster now and the comparison.
And if you see the Nazi propaganda film that came out in about, I guess, 1940 or so, about the Jews and Slavs coming into Europe and undermining Europe, and they had destroyed their own countries, and now they're going to destroy yours, it's really chilling. Yes, there it is. It is really chilling. And I think that in the period before World War II and at various times, it isn't just a new thing. Cyclically, there is a moment where populists appeal to mass fear, and they start to succeed as politicians. Sometimes they wind up in charge, people like Hitler and Mussolini, and sometimes they don't. But we are at one of those moments.
Iris Moncler, you report from a nation that's had successive waves of immigration.
Yes, and there are troubles with it, but I agree with Christopher Dickey that what we're seeing now is an age of rage where people on the ground, the disenfranchised now include white, male, working class people. They include the people who are the basis of that community, and I think that's why it feels so different. So we also are seeing this confusion of hatreds. And they're all being channeled by different populist leaders in different places. And we see that in the Middle East, but we also definitely see it alarmingly, I feel, in Europe. I think you said 1938. It is a feeling of 1938, and that's a very frightening feeling because we know what came after. You didn't know in 1938. You had lived through World War I. You didn't know where it was going to lead. You didn't know it was going to end up in gas chambers. So we don't know where this is going to go, but there's a disquiet in the air, I feel.
It's not just Farage, by the way. On Monday, while the rest of the UK press was paying tribute to the victims of the gay nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida, the Daily Mail's front page screamed about a plot by the government to let 1.5 million Turks, I guess you can read Muslims into that, into Britain as part of the EU migrant deal. When did you get the sense, Anne Elisabeth, that this Brexit campaign was starting to take this kind of turn?
Well, somebody explained that a referendum is always something to which, once you've lost on the question for a long time. It's not you have an election and the party you don't like is elected, and it doesn't matter because there is a schedule of election, as you know, that in 4 or 5 years' time, depending on where you are, there's going to be another election, and then things are going to be possibly going the other way around. But when you have a referendum, and especially something that's as polarizing as Brexit, and which is as decisive as Brexit, then you think, if you break it, this is it, you've broken it, there's no coming back. How, considering
it's winner takes all.
It's winner takes all, or losers all, more than winner takes all. I don't think there's anything to take out of the Brexit, either for the Europeans or for the British. But take, for instance, Wolfgang Schäuble, the German former minister, who was saying at the same time that Europe had to ask itself a number of questions about European reform, which is a very good thing. But in that same interview to Der Spiegel, he said, even if Britain decides to stay narrowly within Europe, she should be punished for having done this. And you think, this is, you want to make them go vote for Brexit. This is the way to talk to them. So there has been a great deal of unconsciousness from the part of those people who were looking at Britain and saying, you're unreasonable, you're trying to defend British interests, why don't you understand that we Europeans are wonderful, and if you do not understand, go back to university for 3 years and then you will be allowed to understand at last that we're wonderful. Well, the French tried to do this 10 years ago at the time of the referendum for the European Constitution, and the population voted no, and that was a warning sign.
And Pankin?
Yeah, I agree. I think that if you look at the way the Remain camp has handled this, people do not like being lectured to.
Yep.
The daily letter that's been produced by NATO, by the IMF, by all the elite. And you have the Justice Minister who is on the side of the Brexit camp, who says maybe people don't believe experts anymore. So, I mean, this is a bit of a problem. And when you have the vast majority of the press which favours Brexit, including presumably the Daily Mail, although it hasn't declared, who are publishing lies, as that front page story was about
it's
the
not
Turks.
quite a lie. It's not quite a lie.
Well, it was unsourced. I read the article.
No, but it's the deal on which 1,500,000 Turks, not 80 million, get the right to travel
To the EU.
To EU and to Britain without a visa. Because actually, when you're French, you can travel to Turkey without a visa, and they can come to the EU. Britain has got different visa agreements with Turkey. You still need visas between the two.
So it is.
But it was a number of people who were categorized as being known for various reasons, diplomats, a certain number of professions. We're not talking about an influx of people looking for jobs. We're talking about people who actually do have very good jobs in Turkey. So that was pushed, but there was a kernel of truth in it.
That's always the best lie, the lie with the kernel of truth at its heart, isn't it?
Yeah. People have been digging up the old quote by Margaret Thatcher. I wish I didn't write it down. Something about how referendums are a tool for demagogues. People have been saying, every campaign here in France, people say, we should have referendums. The people need to be consulted. It's only right that David Cameron, he promised it on the campaign trail. Of course, you should have a referendum. Your thoughts on that, too, Chris?
Well, that was the dumbest damn thing he ever did. I mean, that was incredibly stupid of him to do that. And it's because in an age of populist politics, he was trying to take votes away from UKIP and votes away from the far right. And so you talk about this being democracy.
It got him reelected?
It's not so much UKIP, it's within his own party.
Within his own party.
He was trying to keep his own party together. UKIP have got one MP.
It's politics, but however you play it, it was a dumb thing to do, precisely because Thatcher was right, because referendums, for all the reasons that Anne Elizabeth was pointing out, are dangerous things. But the most dangerous thing is that they're based on emotion. They're not based on... People don't listen to all those lectures. You're exactly right.
They say they want the facts.
They say they say they want the facts, but they don't want the facts. What they want is, we in or out? How do I feel about Europe today? And if you feel threatened by Europe, which is what UKIP plays on, is what the Leave people are playing on. If you feel threatened by Europe and what's happening in Europe, then you vote to leave. Now, because it's emotional, I think the question that comes up now is how will people's emotions be affected by the Jo Cox murder? I think it is an emotional moment, and people are looking at the craziness that led to the murder of Jo Cox. And if it turns out that her murderer or her alleged murderer really was a right-winger and really did talk about Britain first as he was killing her, then that's going to affect people's emotions. I'm not going to say it will decide the vote, but it will have an impact on the vote.
I would even add that it's not just, even if he's not that, you did not have political murders in Britain. The fact that suddenly, there's been a kind of a destroyed veil, something slashing at the veil, and suddenly the country looks like the portrait of Dorian Gray instead of being what people believed. That in itself is a wake-up call that is terrifying for the British, I think.
Yeah.
Because Britain is this funny place, isn't it? You've got, on the one hand, the monarch and the Buckingham Palace, this impenetrable fort, and everything. And on the other hand, members of Parliament who, you always have the photo shot of the Prime Minister walking to number 10 Downing Street and meeting the constituents every week. There is this sort of...
the surgery. You go to your constituency.
It's called a surgery, yes.
And you meet your constituents and they talk to you. French MPs do this too. They work in Paris Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then they go back to their constituencies and they too have une permanence and they talk, and that's part of politics. But it used not to be the British would look at the American president sort of coming in with a motorcade and 45 huge black Hummers full of Secret Service, the least secret agents in the history of mankind, and they were called Secret Service, and you could not approach the president anywhere. And the British were sort of being superior, as they very often are, and say, oh, look at the Americans, they're a bit crazy. And then these things are coming to Britain, and it is a shock to everyone.
Don't tell me you're blaming the Americans for this. Don't tell me you're blaming the Americans for this.
We feel actually we feel much closer to the Americans than we have been, and it's a strange and unpleasant feeling in terms of the attitude to security.
All right, before we go to the break, let's look at the latest tracking polls that preceded Thursday's murder of Jo Cox, and the Leave camp was in the lead. This again, these are surveys taken before the news hit. Let's go around the room very quickly here. Iris Makler, your prediction, what's the vote going to be?
Oh, God. I would have said Leave before Jo Cox's murder, but I agree with Christopher Dickey. I think it's a turning point, and now I'm not sure.
I think they'll remain. I think they'll go.
Anne Penkin?
I also think it's a turning point, and I hope that the result will be to remain.
Probably the momentum. You still had polls that were given. I was in London 3 days ago, just before the murder, and you still had polls that were saying, we're not so sure. The size of the samples is such that we're not certain. But the trend was bad. The trend was going up to Leave, and I think that has been such a wake-up call that possibly it will not happen.
Well, and we have to say, if you're looking at a trend, they've frozen campaigning. They've stopped campaigning on this issue for several days. So it's.
Well, they're frozen the campaigns. The people's minds are churning, and we don't know what will come out. I mean, I myself do not know how I feel about this. It will take me time because it's so alien and it's so distressing. Yeah. We don't know how people will, at the end of it, in less than a week's time.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the distressing events that happened in Orlando, Florida, with that shooting at a gay nightclub. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.